Did you get that? I'm so confused.
Also, ich verstehe nur Bahnhof.
You only understand train station? It's all Greek to me.
Understanding Train Station, Living Between Cultures with Josh and Foelske.
Welcome back to a new episode of Understanding Train Station. I'm Foelske.
And I'm Josh. Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, welcome back. Today is the second episode that we're recording over the distance.
Yes.
And we're not alone. We have a guest, actually, who also is in a different place as us. So, we're recording from three different places right now. 2 in the US, 1 in Germany. And the funny thing is, the American is the one who's in Germany, and the Germans are the ones who are in the US.
Yeah. Nothing's right in the world anymore.
No, nothing's right. And our guest is Michael Phelps. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, I love to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me, Foelske and Josh. Hi to Munich.
Hi. Yeah, so Josh is in Munich. Marco, where are you?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, southeast.
Yeah, so we're in the same time zone, but we're not. We're pretty far away from each other still.
Yeah. Probably 10 hours or something.
It's nice for you guys that you're in the same time zone. For me over here, I'm having to be a night owl tonight to be able to have this interview stay up until 11.
Yeah, we did that on purpose.
Night for me. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's difficult because Marco has a full-time job, and it's 5 p.m. right now, so this was the only time that worked. Really. But yeah, so Marco, we know each other because you have interviewed me before for your podcast or that you host together with
Monique. Mm-hmm. So I was a guest host on Monique's Muttersprache podcast for about 9 months, 8-9 months. I got pretty much in the same way as I did with you. She asked me to be one of the guests, and then eventually I got her co-host for a while until December of 2020.
So I was wrong. You're not doing it anymore. Sorry, I said that wrong then. But that's how we met because you interviewed me back in, what was it, November or something?
Yeah.
And for those of you who want to check out the podcast, it is in German. It's called Muttersprache, so mother tongue. And it's a podcast of the German community living in the US. So the Germans among you can definitely check it out.
It was a really interesting podcast. I've only listened to Foelske's interview, but I've really enjoyed what you guys have been doing with that.
Yeah, it's very different, right? So it's not so structured, let's say. The interesting part was when I interviewed Foelske, of course, with my background, what I searched on her was more, the comparison that she does in her video and YouTube channel. I think it was even before you guys went live with your podcast. And then it was just in the make that you guys came up with Verstehen Sie Bahnhof or Understanding Train Station.
Yeah. It sounded like
so
Verstehen
it was a
Sie
good
Spaß.
concept. And then, so it was a lot of fun because Foelske gave me some insight on the YouTubers. And quite frankly, the audience that we had was probably never really involved understanding how a YouTuber, generates YouTube, what it's all about, what it entails. So it was really interesting.
No, for sure. I think that's one thing that's been interesting for me knowing Foelske. Like my friend group has always been like, or just my parents or family wondering like, how does that even work? Like, how does someone make a living off of working on YouTube? And so that's interesting that you said that. That's something that's been that was part of kind of the experience of interviewing Foelske as well, and bringing kind of some of that knowledge then into your listener.
And I was fortunate.
What's the word? Audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So and I was really fortunate enough. I mean, at one point after I interviewed Foelske, then I got Alisa Jung from ZDF, from the German Second TV. I interviewed her. Then I had a violinist who his name is Benedict Bryden. He's going on tour with Yanni, and as well as he has his own concert tour. So it was quite interesting. I had a really good diversity of people, who traveled around the nation. I had an Olympic swimmer. So it was fun.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. And the reason that we invited you to be on our podcast, of course, is because you're a German who currently lives in the US, but you have so many other experiences too. You work in the hotel business. As you said, you're in Atlanta right now, but you lived in Switzerland before, I believe. You've lived in the UK, Turkey, Poland, and also in different states in the US. So I guess maybe let's just start with, what's your story? Why did you travel the entire world pretty much? What made you come to the US eventually?
So I would say how much time we have, but I guess.
I mean, you don't have to go too much into detail,
Sure.
but I mean, I know a little bit about your story already. The audience, of course, doesn't. So what would you say are the most important points of your story to tell?
So quite interesting. Thanks for asking that. So ultimately, I choose an hotel business because I figured I like to travel. And why not working where other people take vacation and live or spend some time? And I actually get paid for it.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
you know, so and then I began my career. So just going back a little bit, I grew up in Bremen in Germany, northern city, Stadtmusikanten. That's the musicians. Famous story about those. And then I grew up and worked there at the Park Hotel in Bremen, which was a leading hotel of the world. So it's a 5-star hotel. I did my apprenticeship there. Had a great opportunity. It was probably the top hotel at the time in the late 80s.
Wow. And you must have still been young then if you did like an Ausbildung.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I was also young at the time, very young. I just finished school.
Yeah.
And before I studied, I really started this apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And I was pretty fortunate because I met a lot of interesting people at this hotel level. And I was always able to divide between luxury guests, celebrities, governmental people, politicians, actors, actresses. And there was one show in Germany called Musikladen. And the Musikladen was a very famous show from Radio Bremen, 70s, 80s, and I think till the beginning of 90s. And that was a monthly show where they had really the biggest stars in the world, including the Jackson 5.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So I met Jermaine Jackson. I talked to him. I met Carlos Santana. In fact, a little story there is I was in room service at the time. I opened the door and I saw this luggage and handwritten in a letter book, his notes. And I saw a bunch of dark sunglasses. And I thought, if he would miss one, if I take one, then I thought, you know what? I don't want to get in trouble, right?
Okay.
So I was in an apprenticeship, so I didn't take
I
one.
was gonna say you're about to admit to committing a crime here. You
No,
better be
no, no,
careful.
no. But I looked at it and I thought, wow. And I looked at this book, this letter book. It was laying open. And I saw, the Samba Party and Black Magic Woman and all this stuff. And it was really drawn out. And I thought, wow. I mean, it's interesting. So that was like, for me as a very young person, the first contact of these celebrities.
Yeah.
So, and then it went on that I went to southern Germany and ultimately different stations within the hotel industry. For me, important was, again, as I said on the beginning, I worked at places where people usually spend time. If it's winter skiing in Sonthofen on the Sonnenalp, if I lived and spent some time and worked at the Palace in Lucerne in Switzerland, it was the opera season or the music season there. It was tennis tournament. It was the rowing season. So I really had always interesting aspects of in these different areas. Yeah, and then ultimately the goal was I was invited at a wedding in Los Angeles in the beginning of the 90s. And I walked in this Marriott at the time. I remember that Woodland Hills, looked up the atrium, and I thought, wow, I want to work in America.
Damn,
It took a couple more years because I ended up studying in Heidelberg, hotel management, finished up my degree in hotel management. And then I really took like a couple luggages, $750, and flew to New York. Walked, of course, with my resume into the Waldorf Astoria. And guess what? I didn't get hired. I was under the impression I stayed at the Lexington Hotel. I knocked on the door from the human resources manager and I interviewed there. And she said, oh, yeah, that's great. Where are you staying? And I said, oh, at the Lexington Hotel. Oh, I call you. What room number? I'm still waiting for that call.
Oh, wow. That was your
forwarding still set up.
first experience with the American culture, I guess.
That's right. And then I ended up, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine who finished also college in Heidelberg, ended up in Atlanta getting a job and said, hey, the Olympics going to be here in 96. They are looking for foreigners. Why don't you just fly down here? So I spent the weekend in New York. Monday morning, I took the first flight out. Back then it was in the 90s. late 90s, flying was like bus driving, right? So you just went on the plane, spent $200 round trip, New York, Atlanta. And yeah, I ended up staying at a Motel 6 or Travelocity hotel. And then I walked from hotel to hotel and just put my resume out there and tried to speak to somebody. And eventually Hilton hired me.
Oh, wow.
I mean, one question I have for you is how did that work? So were you in New York just as a tourist, or like, because I mean, nowadays, at least, I don't know how it was maybe during that decade.
Yeah, it might have been different.
But getting into the US to find a job is not always the easiest thing to do. You know, oftentimes I feel like people have to have a job offer before they're allowed to come into the country. So how did that work? Were the laws different back then in your experience, or what was your process like there?
I mean, actually, it was equally tough. I tried to apply from Germany or from Europe. I never got an answer. So at the end, the process is really take a plane ride, come over, knock on people's hotel doors, go to one HR office, human resources office, personnel office, to another. I probably managed 3-4 per day, depending on if they had additionally interview immediately scheduled for me. Some of them I actually only walked into the human resources office, left my resume because they didn't want to see anybody for talking. And then some of them, they immediately said, oh yeah, you sound interested, you had a good resume, hold on, let me see if the front office manager is available, if the food and beverage manager is available. You know, I always strive pretty high. I ask for general manager, I ask for assistant, but then I quietly get to know. So American is, and I think Feli talked about that once before, you really have to start on the bottom up. I mean, it doesn't really matter what you have as a background. I just had studies. I had some international experience with my years in the different European countries, but I wasn't really nobody. So when I came back here, you know, I had to start pretty much on the bottom up. On the bottom up means like supervisory level or assistant manager for a restaurant. So New York really didn't pan out because it was really tough. The last interview I had was I had two. At the Peninsula, which worked really well. That was a referral he was a Swiss GM at the Peninsula in New York. And the GM of his friend was the Palace Lucerne GM. And so while they know each other, he allowed me to speak to him. And he said, you know what, Marco? You're going to feel bored if I hire you in this small hotel at the front desk as a J1 student. After 6 months, you're going to come to my office and say, what's next? You know, so I really recommend to you, with your background, finding a chain who is a little bit larger, perhaps a larger hotel, that you can diversify yourself for these 18 months.
I have a quick question in between because of the J1, because that's like, as you just said, J1 student, because that's like an exchange student or I think internship visa. So were you officially an intern? Mm-hmm. Okay,
it was for hospitality. So this Karl Duisberg Society gave these for different, it's kind of a development program for, Josh is going to laugh how I say development now, but
Josh is used to people with accents.
I'm used to interesting pronunciation, so I wasn't going to say anything.
But yeah, so it's kind of a, you know, after you study, this program brings you back some opportunities, kind of an internship. Yeah, you can say it like this. And if you worked for a car factory like Mercedes, BMW, Audi, you do this in America for a period of time. If you do it in hospitality, it's a different program. And that's why the sponsor basically puts down, okay, well, this is like the restaurant. You do some bar work, some stewarding, some culinary. So hotels, of course, has a very vast, diverse program. And it was always easy to get it through, and it got authorized. It wasn't that difficult. I'm sure there are other positions, other jobs, other apprenticeships in these times where in other position in America, it's much more compensant and more difficult to get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's an interesting point though for a lot of the American listeners as well, this concept of like an apprenticeship. I assume you're referring to an Ausbildung.
Yeah.
which is something that doesn't really exist that much in the US. I know some German companies are trying to bring it into kind of the American system. As far as technical training is concerned, it's kind of another path that a lot of Germans will take as opposed to going straight to university and studying there. They partner with a company to do a sort of apprenticeship. I know my company, for example, has a couple Ausbildungen that they offer. But that's something that's completely foreign to a lot of Americans. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that as well.
Yeah, sometimes you can refer to it as a traineeship, I think, because that's somewhat a thing in the US. So maybe people get an idea from that term more. But it's a pretty big thing in Germany.
Yeah. So the important part, I think, is what Americans not so much aware of is we go for a month at a time at school. And then you do the same what you learn in that apprenticeship period in school for about 2 months on job training. Mm-hmm. And then after, I guess, a year and a half, you do an intermediate testing on both the theoretical portion and the practical portion. And then usually you study for the whole apprenticeship period. The normal period is about 3 years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty long. Do we want to go back to your story, Marco? Because I think we were so at the point where like it didn't work out in New York.
It didn't work out in New York. So I took this plane to Atlanta.
Yeah.
As I said, and I stayed at one of those motels along the highway. And then I ended up at the Hilton, Hyatt, Marriott, interviewed there. And the Hilton offered me a position. So I ended up going back to New York, packing my bags because that was my initial plan. And then I ended up flying back home, took all the paperwork, which in my case, while having a job, while having this pre-work done, it took only 5 weeks. It might be longer nowadays, but it was 5 weeks. I had my pink slip, which is a J1 pink slip when you got here into the country. It's a visa. It was good for 18 months. You had a passport. I had my luggages together. I ended up staying for a couple of weeks in a hotel. I had to apply for the Social Security. I had to apply for a bank account. I think you went over all this in your YouTube broadcast. It's quite difficult for a foreigner without having credibility, without having any history. It's not as easy. That's why actually these hotel partners allow you to stay for the first couple of weeks there. And then I found a good apartment, which was in a walking distance from the Hilton downtown, which is the second largest hotel in Atlanta. It has 1,250 rooms, so it's a pretty big box. 33 stories high if you count the top restaurant on top. It had in total 4 food and beverage outlets. It had a bar. It has a famous restaurant called Trader Vic's, which is in the basement. It's still there. Even now after Corona, during COVID, they just recently reopened. There's a fine dining restaurant, a Russian-French one on top of the hotel called Nikolai's Roof. And then there were a couple of restaurants in the medium floor. I became an assistant
Sounds like
restaurant.
A huge place.
Huge place. Oh, yeah. I became an assistant restaurant manager for one restaurant location, and I was basically a shift leader.
Okay.
And I did this for about a year, and then the food and beverage director said, "Oh, you're pretty talented. Would you like to become a restaurant manager? We have an opening in another restaurant." And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then right before the Olympics, my visa expired.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
So for me was really the option. I asked the Human Resources Office, and they said, "Okay, we have to ask Hilton Corporation. We're interested, but I don't know what the next process is." So they asked, and they said, "Yeah, we're interested. Now you need to convert your J1 into an H1B, which is
a work visa.
It's a work visa, yeah. You know, you hear this always in Silicon Valley that many people are working on these H1B working visas. Mm-hmm. So it was tough on my end because all of my documents had to be translated into English.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So, the hotel management school in Heidelberg and my experience, everything had to be translated. And then it was somebody at the university in South Carolina. I happened to get to know a secretary of the dean, And she happened to be German, and she took the entire paperwork and she put it on her letterhead together with the dean, translated with me over the phone at the time. Zoom didn't exist, right?
Yeah.
So I was over the phone and I explained everything to the dean, and she verified everything with the notary person, and they did all the paperwork, and then they sent it back to me. My attorney that I took had to file that report. And back then, the H-1B, while I was still under J-1, took about, I would say, 3 months.
Okay, that's actually fast.
Yeah. And $2,000 later. And then I got it. So my visa actually expired, J-1, at the end of April.
Yeah.
And then I took a 2-week vacation.
Yeah.
I couldn't leave the country. I couldn't do anything other than taking a short trip. I did a little bit of a round trip to Colorado, Arizona, Nevada for 2 weeks, came back. The visa was there. I started, continue working. And then I had my H-1B, which was 2 terms of 3 years.
Okay.
One thing that you mentioned earlier, where you were talking about kind of the intro into your story, was that you were in I think you said LA, and you saw this atrium, and was it the Marriott there? And you said, oh, in this moment, I know I want to work in the US. And for me, as an American living in Germany, and now kind of getting adjusted to the German work conditions, all of the vacation days I get, from my perspective, it's why would you want to go to the U.S. where the privileges that workers get are so, I'll say, less than in the U.S. What was that the big draw for you that you wanted to move to the U.S. and work there?
I think it's just this excitement, and quite frankly, we in Europe, I would say, not only specific to Germany, but even in Europe, I don't think we have these big hotels. So the impressive part was walking into this atrium and I said, wow, I had no idea what the working conditions is in America. I had no idea what benefits I basically in there. I had no idea. And quite frankly, when you then come as a trainee, you be covered by the government. So it's kind of a controlled system. I would say nowadays, when I'm long time living here and under different circumstances, now it's like, now it feels like there's a big difference. Before, it never really felt that way.
So how old were you then when you moved to the US?
I was middle 20s. So, which was in 94 I came. I was a young 20s. And then I thought, well, so I had my apprentice done. I studied, did some experience, and then I came really after my studies over here, which was fine. So for me, it was just like another country of exploring. And America was, after this wedding, I thought, oh, this is an awesome opportunity just to see the American hospitality. The Americans would probably say, oh, I want to go to Switzerland. But for me, it was like, it was like the infamous to try that.
So at that point, had you already lived in Switzerland, or was that afterwards?
I had lived before. I actually lived twice in Switzerland. So I lived before in Switzerland. And my language skills, English, weren't really good. So this was actually one of the reasons why when I was in Switzerland, we had a lot of Japanese guests and American guests. There was this times where a lot of American came over. And the first night, they always stayed in a hotel. I was a bartender. We made good tips. And my English was very poor. And I thought, I'm going to work on my English. That was the reason that after my season finished, I worked a summer season. And once the season was finished in Switzerland, I ended up going to England.
Okay, interesting.
With the goal of improving your English.
Yeah. I happened to stay at a friend's of my parents. I was a swimmer in my younger years. And there was an exchange program where English swimmers came over to Bremen, and Bremen went as a club over to England near London, and we were swimming back and forward. And one time this president, where we were staying privately, said, hey, if you ever wanted to live in England, call me and you can come and stay with us.
Wow.
And
That's
then
awesome.
in 1990, I decided that's what I want to do. You know,
that's another great example of why it's so important to try to build up your international connections, because they open those doors that no one was really able to foresee.
Yeah. You did the swimming thing pretty intensely, right? You were like a Leistungssportler.
Yeah. I was pretty. I mean, back in the days, it was very competitive. I swam with some big names, so the German would probably know Michael Groß. So he was born the same age as me, and he made it to the world records and world championship, 200 butterfly. They call him the Albatross. So he was like the 20 years or 15 years prior to Michael Phelps becoming big. But yes, so it was a big sport that I followed and the sport that I did as a teenager.
But then you kind of gave it up for your dream to just
Work
be an
hospitality.
adventurer and travel the
Live
world.
where other people vacation.
Yeah,
That's right.
exactly.
That's
so
right.
then what were the other stops on your journey? So you went to Switzerland, England, the US, but then you didn't stay. So you're in the US now, obviously, but you didn't stay since the 90s, right? You've left in between.
So that's a good point. So I passed the Olympic Games in 96 in Atlanta. Then I went to Disney World, worked for Hilton at Disney Orlando. So the best part was, the best part was each station, there's always something unique happen. So during the time that I was in Orlando, Animal Kingdom opened up.
Oh, wow.
And then we were guinea pigs. So we were the first ones to learn about the safari and walk and drive through that part. And then my next stop was New Jersey and New York. During a big city strike of New York, I ended up as a manager or food and beverage director helping out the New York Hilton, because everybody doing the pit stop, employees were not allowed to go in, but managers, yes.
Okay.
Then we lived on the Hudson River. 9/11 happened. So
Wow.
Oh, you were there for 9/11?
That's crazy.
yeah, and actually my wife was pregnant 7 months with our first child, our daughter. The night before 9/11, we were actually at the 40th concert anniversary of Michael Jackson at Madison Square Garden.
Wow.
We saw the Jackson 5, we saw Chris Rock, we saw Elizabeth Taylor, Britney Spears. You name it, everybody was there at that concert. And then when 9/11 happened, and I was the only, let's say, director in the hotel because my GM was supposed to fly out, for a minute I thought, wow, last night we were at this concert. Today is this beautiful weather. Now 9/11 happened and the terrible tragic from the World Trade Center, but nobody could leave. So I knew that everybody was still in the city who were at these concerts, and these tragic face situations happened. It was just, it was so surreal, I would say. And then from there, I went back to Atlanta. So Atlanta became always like my pit stop from Germany, my second home away from Germany.
People would think you probably worked for Delta.
Yeah. Actually, I worked at that time then for the Hilton Airport. I don't want to make too much Hilton commercial here, but all these years I spent with the same company, I got transferred and promoted all the time. And then I ended up getting promoted when Hilton merged globally with the international portion. Believe it or not, they were separated in 1964 and they got reunited in 2007. They needed an American trained manager with European passports overseas. And so that's when I actually ended up going back to Birmingham, England, because I had a European passport, but I worked long time for Hilton in Americas.
Yeah.
And of course they were peeved. So if you are like in Birmingham, England, German American, it wasn't
telling
the best
you what to do.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because Birmingham is not as metropolitan or cosmopolitan as London was. And it was a tough year, I would say. It was a good experience, but it was a very different experience that I had in mind before I ended up having it. And then from there, I went to Poland. I spent working
That's completely out of the blue.
Yeah, that's completely different.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, Josh. Germans, even so they are living, border to border with Poland, if you ask Germans, I would say 50% of them are perhaps half of the East Germans have maybe some relationship ever happened to the border. West Germans, very few.
Yeah.
So for me, before I accepted the job, I told them I need to fly first to Warsaw and to see the surrounding. And I was very impressed because I worked there from 2008 till 15. It was actually the opening of Poland and the joining a few years after their European Union joining. And so it was very prospered period. So while everybody was in this financial crisis, Poland was not. In fact, the EU pumped in so much money. The European Soccer Championship, UEFA Fußball-Europameisterschaft, will take place in 2012. So they pumped a lot of money in there as well as stadium build. And then after a short sting in Warsaw, I ended up at the and led, or as a general manager, I was running Sheraton in Poznan, Posen in Deutsch, which was closer to the German border than actually to Warsaw. So we spent more time actually in Berlin on weekends or whenever we could on the German side than we would spend time other than, working and a few surroundings within Poland.
Wow. So then did you have to speak Polish, obviously, to be able to work there?
I know 10 words.
Really?
That's interesting. I mean, I guess that's a good point. I mean, obviously the hospitality industry is very English heavy, no matter where you are in the world.
I mean, it's an American company, right? So I worked for Starwood or respectively Sheraton. Now it's converted. It's a Marriott owned group. But, there were German guests, there were American guests. All front of house team members spoke English.
Okay.
Back of house. I mean, so the interesting part on Poland was, for the first time, I've seen only one nation working at the hotel. I've never seen this before in my entire career. Everybody was white and one culture. I mean, I ended up having a hostess from the Ukraine and me, German, American.
Yeah.
Everybody else was Polish, national.
Okay.
Interesting.
There was no diversity. And then in 2015, after 6 years being in Posen, 7 years in total in Poland, 7.5, I ended up coming back as a family back to the States. And guess where we went? Atlanta.
Georgia. I think that's an interesting or one thing that comes to mind now, especially since you were talking about kind of moving around between different countries, and obviously that carries different languages with it and then also with the family. How was that for your children and like that whole process of moving from country to country? Obviously, as your family continued to grow, I'm sure that became more difficult.
I mean, from my perspective, it sounded and seemed to be pretty easy. I think we did right moves at right times. So when we moved to England, my daughter at the time was 5. My son was just 2. So it wasn't a big deal. Believe it or not, my daughter caught up with English accent in school because they starting with 5 years in England. I think it took her less than 4 months and she had a British accent. Mama, can I have a cup of tea, please? Like, wow, so it was so interesting. And then when we went to Poland, they adapted and learned pretty quickly Poland. Now in Poland, we stayed much longer.
So did they have to speak Polish in school?
No, they end up in an international school. But so the interesting part on Poland was Polish people had this experience once they open up to the EU, once they start, let's say, having everything that the European Union has and everybody who lives in the West, they start buying up cars and TVs and houses. Once they had everything, they sent their kids all of a sudden to school because they had the money. But I guess in previous life, they didn't have so many opportunities. So at one point, they just said, okay, here we go. Let's send them then to international schools. So while my daughter or my son went to school, they ended up not with many internationals. It was mainly Polish nationals.
Okay. So even though classes were probably in English, they still had a lot of Polish friends then.
And they learned that.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. Pretty cool. Yeah. So for my daughter, probably more so, and mind you, my wife is from Ecuador. So
okay.
we call ourselves global citizens.
Yeah, I was going to say.
We had a
That's
Polish
very
cat, so it was really funny. So, another anecdote or story, we were sitting in a restaurant in Poland, breakfast in a hotel, and then we were talking 4 languages on the table. So my kids spoke Polish to the service staff. We spoke either German, always me, to the kids, my wife Spanish, and together we spoke English. The next door table was Polish, and the lady came from Hamburg, and all of a sudden the gentleman got up and said, "Excuse me, am I at Candid Camera here?" Foelske Camera, because obviously they made a joke about it while we were speaking so many languages. He thought he's in the wrong movie,
Yeah, I mean,
That's
I would
crazy.
think the same thing. Like, what family speaks 4 different languages just at the dining table? Interesting.
So then the main languages in your home are then German and Spanish?
Yeah, in English. So
And
together,
in English, yeah.
I don't really, I understand a good portion Spanish, speak a few words.
Yeah.
My wife does the same with German. She's not so into it. So kind of understand that we were never really living long term, let's say, up that we maybe visit my family or my parents. But so for her that's not like a language. And the same is for me in Spanish. I mean, we visit Ecuador a few times. We went to Spain many times, but while we were living in Europe. But quite frankly, I mean, that's not something I can understand and hear the basics. But together we all speak in English.
Okay.
Interesting. That's such an interesting, I mean, first of all, life story, but also
Yeah.
just a family constellation that you have all those different languages at home and like you lived in all these different countries. Yeah, like very adventurous life. And then you said you moved back to the States. So, and as we've heard now, you've lived in different places in the States. You've lived in so many different countries and cultures. So, are there any like biggest culture shocks that you could remember? Like one situation or like one country where you feel like adapting was very tough? Or was it always easy for you anyways because you were always in that hotel environment?
So that's a fantastic question. So I think as a family, we are very easy to adapt because we got used to traveling and moving around. It started off when I was alone. And then slowly, I added up the girlfriend, became the wife, and then with the first daughter, and we kept moving.
Yeah.
And even a little bit when you move within the US, there is a little bit differences between New York, New Jersey versus Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh, yeah.
And then, so I wouldn't say culture shock, but it was different. For my wife, for instance, it was a culture shock to be in England.
Okay.
Because having her background being Latina, and then going to Birmingham, where there's a blue-collar workforce, a little bit, I would say, is Detroit. It's more of a working type of a class. They're building the Jaguar there. They're building the Range Rover. They used to be in jewelry business. So they have a lot of Pakistanis and Indian. So sometimes it happened to her. She was sitting in the bus, and then all of a sudden the bus driver said, "You need to sit like in this row." So she really felt discriminated.
Wow.
In
Wow,
that sense.
yeah.
So she didn't really had a great time, let's say. And then
Yeah, I can understand
via Europe or Germany, we went into Poland. And in Warsaw, it wasn't so much, it was more of a diverse city as well. Poznan, I would say not so much.
Okay.
Poland in itself, that's my opinion now, humble opinion, went backwards in these recent years versus in the time when we were there.
Yeah, I think that's like the perception that you get from the news coverage too.
Yeah. I mean, between the time that I was there from 2008 until, I would say until 2013, 14, it was really glorious period because it was this adventure, this investment, these football, as I said, upcoming Europameisterschaft. So all this stuff was really important and it made sense, and they built the highways. And then all of a sudden, after 13 and 14, it went a little bit backward. Now, we left 15. Poznan is always, again, west in Poland. They are pretty liberal, democratic, I would say. They are not so behind the curtain or behind farmers, not so mainland people. They were very Western. So they traveled a lot. You could drive from Poznan to Berlin within 2.5 hours. I mean, it's not a problem.
Okay.
I flew to Berlin via driving 200 on a highway or 250 kilometers within an hour and 45 minutes. So
Just
my
German
daughter
things.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we need to put on the screen how much that is in miles per hour.
Yeah, we will for sure.
It's probably 140 or 150. It was pretty fast, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's legal
That's
driving,
my
not
average
necessarily
speed when I
wrong.
drive to work anyway, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then basically we came back, and then I ended up knocking on, no surprise, the Hilton door again here in Atlanta. And then I worked for them for 3.5 years. We renovated the hotel, so it was very good. I went, here was again Super Bowl 52 or something. So it was another interesting portion. So like I said, it was always something in the unique places wherever I worked. And then I ended up going to California about 2 years ago.
Okay.
You're saying so your family didn't come with you?
I went alone first because the daughter was still in high school. So I ended up going April 2019. The daughter was going still in high school. The son was finishing up middle school. So we made the decision. I go first, the first 3 months. I almost have done this before. So in a couple of times, like in Poland, the family stayed behind in Germany, living in my parents' house for a couple of months before they joined me.
So you would kind of like test the waters, and then they would come
Exactly. So
afterwards.
it's better for me because I didn't have to worry about that anybody is complaining that, oh, you work late, you work 12 hours. Hospitality, this is one very big disadvantage is, if you have friends, you either have friends in hospitality or they live totally somewhere else in the world because quite frankly, you work all the time, 365, 24/7. I mean, there is no such, I have always the weekends off or I have Christmas off, Thanksgiving. No, never.
Yeah. And if you have days off, it's the time when other people are at work.
That's right.
Yeah.
So my last stop was basically going to California, which was always a dream to end up going to California. And then as a family joined me back in August of 2019, and we stayed till the pandemic. Okay. And then the resort got closed, unfortunately.
Oh, no.
I got furloughed, which was a first-time experience ever in my life. Hospitality, I would have never thought. I mean, even during big wars and big other financial crises, hospitality always survived. But this time it was just, it felt differently, and immediately it just stopped totally.
Yeah. Man, how surreal. I mean, like you said, hospitality, no matter what's going on in the world, always seems to be something that's booming. But I mean, this pandemic has definitely brought that sector to a complete halt.
Yeah. And that's pretty sad. And so then the decision was made again, the family came over and said, hey, what do you think if we go back, driving to our famous place, Atlanta? Mind you, we purchased a home here in 2004 and we still have the same home. Yeah. We had it always rented out when we were away. It's a pretty desirable place. It's pretty close to the city center. It is in a nice green neighborhood. We were very fortunate when we bought it back in the days, and we kept it, and it was always a best decision. And then this time we said, when we moved back, in fact, we actually moved back to the house in December of 2020. So we had to.
So just recently.
Yeah, just recently. So we stayed at a friend's house for a few months with our baggage boxes and everything else. And then we just moved back, and then we said, you know what, this time is probably a good time to just say, we settle down. I'm a little tired now of moving around. If I move, I would do.
I wonder why.
I'm tired just from listening to everything. That is a lot of different places that you've lived at in your life.
But I mean, it's fun, So I mean, it has good and bads for it. I met a lot of interesting people, and as I said, I get paid while other people travel around. I mean, being in La Quinta Resort, it's a Waldorf Astoria. I mean, it's so beautiful. It was from Hollywood, it was 96 miles away. So movie stars was able to go there on weekends, always. It's not quite 100 years old. It's 96 years old. It was built in the mid-20s and 1920s. And so it's an interesting place. And I would say that always these places, I always made sure it's unique atmosphere and unique places, you know?
Yeah, I mean, so that it's just a crazy story with all of the moving back and forth and everything. But earlier you mentioned that there was a clear difference between, and you said it wasn't huge, but there was a difference between life in New York and life in Atlanta. And for me as an American, it's interesting to hear how foreigners perceive the difference between, we'll say, the Northeast and the South. So what would you say was maybe one or two of the biggest differences that you noticed?
Yeah, and also between, I mean, California too, and the other places that you've stayed at. Because, like, I think we've never had anyone, or like, definitely not on the podcast, but I don't even know if I know of a foreigner who's lived in that many different states in the US. So yeah, go ahead. I'm interested to hear that
I'm
too.
the first.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So New York, of course, is very speed, you know, everything. I mean, you can tell the difference, you know, and even New Yorkers say this. If you see somebody walking around, no, it's a tourist.
Yeah.
But if somebody works in New York, they go head down and they just follow their theme.
Yeah, that's something that I think you can even experience as a tourist, because I've been there, I think, twice in my life so far. And every time I'm there, I'm like, wow, I don't think I would want to live here, just because you just get that vibe that it's not very laid back. Like everyone's always rushing somewhere, super busy. Yeah.
Total stress, and people really, New Yorkers don't really feel like, first of all, the city looks better from the distance. When you are in New York, it's pretty dirty, right?
Okay.
So it's fact. I mean, we lived on the Hudson River side, so in New Jersey. We had this beautiful view over the skyline of Manhattan.
Wow.
And the city, I mean, awesome. I mean, at night, you see the lights, the spectrum, and we saw Times Square. We were pretty much in that area there where we lived, across from the Hudson. But then you go into the city, and then it's all, it's very different. So, and then coming down south, it's all laying back. I mean, so it's a little disturbing. You know, I was here before, went up to Orlando, then, you know, New Jersey, New York, and then you come back to, oh yeah, here we go again. You're gonna ask people twice. You're gonna explain things a little bit more differently. You know, if you too forcefully and you just say, "Hey, Josh, can you do this?" They're gonna look at you, and so it's a little bit different. Food culture very different. So it's a lot of Southern dishes, which I enjoy personally. I mean, you know, so there's coal, you would say.
Cabbage?
No, not cabbage.
Coleslaw.
Coleslaw too, because of the ribs and everything else. No, I was referring to kale. So the kale so the kale in California is in a salad cold. Here it's of course done. It's made hot together with dishes like the ribs, or with some maize brot, so with cornbread. Yeah. And so each of these, you know, that's another interesting part of the food culture is slightly different, right? I mean, in New York, you would get very international, cosmopolitan food. You go sushi, Italian, you go to the Chinese place, you go to an American dish, you go to a vegan place. While in Atlanta, you have these mom and pop restaurants. They were the old Mary Bushes, or you see Margaret Mitchell house, and you feel like you'd be back in the 1930s. So, I mean, it's still all there. So it's fantastic. You know, Varsity, which is a very famous place, similar to a different type of a hot dog McDonald's stand. It's a very famous place.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, so going to California, did you have to adapt between Atlanta and California too? Did you have to change your tone or something?
So in California, everything is you have to be step almost on eggs sometimes.
Okay.
That I felt the labor rules, labor laws are very different. And you're going to be really careful when you talk to team members, how you talk to them. And very pleasant. Oh, it's my pleasure. Oh, love to help you out. Very healthy lifestyle. Everybody works out in a way. I mean, you know, they either start running early in the morning, or they do it at night. They eat in healthy restaurants. I mean, you wouldn't see too much fried food 2 days in a row.
Very different than Atlanta.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, but then, you know, the weather plays that role. So it's a sunset state. So, I mean, it's yeah, it's awesome.
So there are some differences, but it's not like a major culture shock or anything like that.
I mean, it's not anymore a culture shock. I'm sure, maybe perhaps 30, 40, 50 years, I think there were maybe more differences. Nowadays, I mean, you get off the plane, even in Europe. I mean, Josh, I don't know if you have traveled now between Munich and Spain and France or whatever. You get off the plane and you see Realkauf, you see Saturn, and you see whatever, different stores the same way. Yeah. I was always impressed when I visited, for instance, Seattle, or I went to New York, to Florida. Home Depot is everywhere, Target, Walmart. I mean, it's like, so you feel like you're in the same country. So if you want to, you can stay and feed yourself the same way.
Yeah, for sure. That's how I always feel about the US, but I've never lived anywhere else. I've traveled a lot, but I think when you live in different states, it's definitely a different story. Yeah. It's definitely fun, yeah, for sure. And like you actually get to soak up the culture a lot more if you live in different places in the US. Have you ever thought about moving back to Germany permanently at all?
It's a little bit of a mixed bag. I think because of my family and my children now. So my daughter, 19, studies at ASU in Arizona State for this is her second year as a sophomore. My son is now doing high school here. I can see myself probably finishing work in the US. And then I probably, in my heart, I'm always German and American. In the meantime, after my green card period, I also became in 2010 US citizen as a dual citizen. So I have a
congratulations.
Beibehaltigungsbescheinigung, the word was for, and so I was able to hold on to both passports. I always like to go to Germany, but it's always nice to come back. I like this social part, respectively, from the coverage. I think the system in itself, I enjoy that overseas. I do think the freedom in America with doing your own business, be creative, moving around, it's much easier here.
Yes, I agree with that.
It's just such an interesting story because I don't know many people who work in the hospitality industry, and the people I do know, though, travel a lot and move a lot. And it's just interesting to hear such an international experience from someone. Yeah, I don't know. It's just something, it's not a story that you hear every day. So I'm really appreciative that you've taken the time to come and tell us some about kind of your history or your history. Gosh, my English is getting so bad. Tell us some about your story.
My bio, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I met interesting people. I mean.
Yeah. So what were some of the most interesting stories that you have to tell about meeting celebrities and stuff like that?
Okay, so in Poznan, in my hotel, since we were the number 1 5-star hotel, we had literally all the time celebrities because whenever there were concerts or there were politicians, so they all showed up. So one interesting part, we had a photo shoot for 80 brides, and the same day, Armin van Buuren, the DJ, was staying in our hotel. And Armin van Buuren and we had breakfast downstairs in the restaurant. And then all of a sudden, the organizer from this bridal show run over and said, Mr. Marco, can you ask Armin van Buuren to come with the 80 brides and we take one photo shoot together? So all of a sudden, we have a photo where both of us, we staying there with 80 in white dresses. As a story. Another time, I met the Dalai Lama, and I have to tell you that he stayed in Warsaw in my hotel where I was the hotel manager there, and I greeted him on the door. There were actually Tibetan outside, and then he came, and you don't really shake hands, but I also tell you that probably beside the Pope. He really has an aura around him. He is definitely shining, and he's definitely, I wouldn't say overhuman, superhuman, but it's an interesting, when you stand in front of him, you feel there is a certain power that surrounds him. And we met a few times, and we have a few pictures together, which was very unusual because normally he wouldn't post with anybody, so... and And that was another interesting part, that my first week actually in Warsaw, there was the Polish National Day. I still remember that is November 11th. And I was there just for a few days, and all of a sudden every president of Europe showed up, because there was this big celebration that Poland joined the EU. And again, our hotel was one of those center hotels. And there was at one point this guy who got poisoned, the Ukraine president Shevchenko, who also happened to be poisoned by the Russians. That was never proved. But anyway, so he showed up, and I greeted him, and he had this thick makeup on his face.
Oh, really? Okay.
And because his face was all narben, so it was all scarred.
Yeah, scarred up. Yeah.
And he was no longer allowed to ever eaten again, like just off the cup, because it would be very careful for him.
Wow.
So he had a very special medicine. He had his own cook on there.
Oh, wow.
Crazy.
And then I met, of course, most of the presidents. And then, fortunately or not fortunately, even our last one I have met in person.
Wow.
Before he was president. I met him in 2007 when he was having a concept, actually building a house as a Trump building here in Midtown. I was never into politics, so for me, it doesn't really matter who is who. I met George Bush in New Jersey when he was campaigning for his presidency, and I met him, and we had a very good talk. I felt, he is definitely coming from Texas, being a farmer. But it was interesting to see his perspective.
Quick question. Do you have like a wall with like pictures of all these people that you've met? Like the ones that I guess you did take a picture with? Because I'm assuming you don't always take pictures with them.
I have a lot of pictures. I don't have them up on the wall, but I do have all of the pictures.
Okay.
So, I mean, if I want you, I can send you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, please do. That's pretty cool.
That would be cool.
So I met musicians, of course, from different genres. So as I said, from the years, jazz musician, one of my favorite actually is Pat Metheny. And Pat Metheny is somebody coming from the Midlands in the US. And I follow him at different concerts. I saw him in Poland, in Germany, in England. I saw him here in Atlanta. And we taking pictures together multiple times, because he was saying, sometimes we write each other little notes back and forward. I'm a big fan of U2. I follow them, I guess, since their early days when they were playing at Rock Palast, which was on TV. And then, of course, Live Aid, the different opportunities. And then I saw them on concerts. And I tried to see them on unique places. So I went with my mother to Moscow in 2010 when she was, let me think about it, she was 72 years old.
Okay.
And then we went again together in Belfast in 2019 when she was basically 80 years old.
Wow. Okay. But have you ever met them personally too?
I have met them just briefly with my son, actually. When we were in New Jersey, Bono walked by, and Bono signed for my son a CD, and we said hello. But that's actually the one act. I mean, I've seen like everybody. They have never stayed in my hotels. So that one always is so far still a myth.
So what's your hotel right now? It's the Hilton in Atlanta, or one of the...
So right now I work at the Embassy Suites, which is Embassy Suites Alpharetta, which is a Hilton branded hotel, but it's an all suite property, the Embassy Suite Alpharetta, which is on the northern portion. We have 150 suites, and I started working there the end of October, beginning of November. And
so I guess let's tell you too that they need to come there and stay there.
Exactly. Once concerts are a thing again, they need to go and have a concert in Atlanta and stay at your hotel.
Behind us, actually, there's a huge amphitheater.
Oh, yeah?
And it's a very big one, and it's usually booked, and people stay at my hotel and my new place, but quite frankly, there's no concerts. Yeah. I think the first concert are scheduled by the end of June, and they're not even so sure because it's part of Live Nation, and they're not so sure if it's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Unfortunately.
any other big names that you've met?
Well, I mean, so I
Because the ones so far haven't been that impressive.
No, they were pretty impressive. I just felt like
No,
there
I'm
might be
just
more,
joking.
but
I mean, so there was, for instance, I met Deep Purple. So they came by and we had a Gaudi area actually. So it was kind of fun.
My brain just when I hear Gaudi, I wasn't thinking of the artist. I was thinking of like a Gaudi.
Yes. So and then so I asked the manager actually said to us, we had it was around Valentine's, and we had a bet in the lobby to advertise Valentine's weekend.
okay.
And
Wow.
And this was kind of cool. We were standing there, and then the manager said, let's do the entire band and yourself just fall back into this bed. And then Deep Purple said, nah, we're not going to do this. So we took a picture together, and it was kind of fun. And they signed a guitar, which was an interesting proportion. Yeah, unfortunately, the guitar I never really took with me. I wish I would, but I didn't. So, I mean, you name it. I mean, there's lots of other people that I've met. As I said, some politicians, some actors. I met the Dr. House.
Cool.
Oh yeah, Hugh Laurie.
Hugh Laurie.
Yeah.
He looks in person just like in Dr. House.
That's funny.
Just like it is.
It's surprising though to find out that he's British though in real life, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then I met many German bands as well. So Kraftwerk. One actually just recently passed away. Behind me, you also see I'm collecting swatches, and Kraftwerk actually has signed one of my swatches. So it was kind of interesting.
That is cool.
Awesome. Well, I don't know if I have any other questions left, actually.
I know that's what I'm trying to look at right now.
I guess we could. The one question, we've kind of covered it a little bit. I was wondering how your kids thought about the whole moving thing. I know that they grew up with it, so maybe they didn't mind. But I know that, like, as a teenager especially, it does suck sometimes to switch schools, to have to leave all your friends behind. So was that ever an issue?
What helps was, I think, because I put them in swimming. As I was swimming, I thought it'd stay constant with the swimming. So while they went to schools in different countries and international schools or in different areas, they also swam. So for them, that was this constant, and you learn when you go to different competitions, you meet the same people. And so in case of my daughter, and then later on my son as well, when we were in Warsaw and then in Poznan, and then we traveled to Berlin for competition. So they saw each other, always the same people. So I think, speaking now for them, but I think it wasn't as dramatic as some families because we were never bound multiple years. The longest time was 6 years in Poznan. All other moves were between 1 to 4 years, which sometimes it appears to be unrested, but for us was always very important. Wherever we lived, that was our home. We never had anywhere we lived more than us as a family around. So if we want to see more family, we had to travel for families.
Yeah.
And then now it's interesting. So my daughter now ended up going to ASU. And then when I told her, oh yeah, you go to ASU and I work in La Quinta and Palm Springs, she said, why you want to move out west? Because I'm going there? We're still more than 5 hours away driving.
Yeah, it's still pretty far away.
And I said, I said, the good news is I can visit you on the same day, but I'm not there 5 minutes later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think she got it, and then she really enjoyed the time when we were out there. Now she just went back in August, and then she came home just for the Christmas period, and she flew out on New Year's Eve. So I think we are far away. Now we are 5 hours flying away. Before it was 4.5 hour driving away. But I think, we got used to it.
Yeah.
And we got used to it to stick together as a family, So it's kind of, we made home wherever we were.
Yeah.
I think that's the best explanation. And then I think that's the better way to do it, because otherwise it's going to be tough. If you think in the past, oh, it was beautiful there, or it was nice there, you can always go back as a visitor. In fact, we have friends everywhere. And to your point, Josh, hospitality, you make friends for life. You really work all the time, but then so you're going to make some friendships.
Quick follow-up question going back to your kids, because I was wondering, how did it work with like switching schools? Did they ever have to repeat a full year? Because they went to school in the UK, in Poland, and in the US, right?
My daughter actually went first grade in England, then second grade in Germany.
Oh, okay.
And only for 4 months. And believe it or not, the dean, the director of the school said, let's put her in a second grade. She will manage. And believe it or not, within 4 weeks, she caught up quite well.
Wow.
And every Monday, they had to write down what they did on weekends. And of course, she was never fluent in Germany. So on the beginning, she just written like 1 or 2 sentences. And there was a similar activity in England where every Monday they had to talk about the weekend in English. Here in German, they had to write down a little Aufsatz, a little documentary. And then, so quite interesting, after 4 months, all of a sudden she'd drawn a whole page.
Wow.
Cool.
And she got quite fluent in that. And then she went in Poland. So did my son. That's when he started in school. 2 different international schools. Actually, my daughter started in a Canadian international school. So she was exposed a little bit to French in addition to English. And then we moved to Poznan. Then she went to an international school. And later they ended up in the British international school, which was much nicer in Poznan from the terms of the dialect and the way how they systemized the program. And then she came right back here to the States within high school. And my son was doing the last year of elementary. And then he was doing the entire 4 years middle school.
So they never had to repeat a grade.
They never had to
That is
repeat.
actually very impressive.
My question is, what type of accents do they have?
True.
I mean, I'm sure, I would guess probably your son has probably a pretty American accent if he came, if he's gone to high school the entire time in the US.
I think they are neutral. They are very neutral accentual. So I would say, because my wife has this English with a Spanish accent. I have this English with the German accent. And then they have probably a pretty neutral. I think my son probably has the most common American because he spent now the last 5-6 years getting into it since 2015 midsummer, being back in America.
Yeah, very crazy.
Crazy.
But that's cool.
I think that was also the last topic that I wanted to cover. I mean, honestly, props to you and your whole family that first of all, that you're brave enough to like live a life like that, and also that you seem to manage everything very, very well. I mean, your whole family, your kids.
Important.
Yeah,
I think that's important that you stay relatively positive. Like I told also before, when you work in hospitality, I'm not really openly political involved. So I have to be very neutral because I don't want to take sides of anybody.
Right.
Otherwise you're going to be, there's a few things you never want to be in hospitality thinking or speaking of religious beliefs, talking about sports that could backfire big time.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't expect that one.
Interesting.
Sports, and then political aspect.
All these neutrality tactics you learned while you were in Switzerland.
Yeah, exactly. So you can be very neutral. You can talk about it, Super Bowl, but I wouldn't say, I'm voting for him and, Tom Brady and Tampa and let's, that's the 10 times he was there and change. No, I'm not going to get involved in those things. So and that's the same on the, I talk about music, but I wouldn't say, and I share my opinion in saying, I like Michael Jackson, or I like U2, or I like I'm a pretty flexible guy. I listen to radios and new stuff. Of course, I get news from different sources. I like to watch actually German news. So I usually go and watch Heute Journal for the fact that I think it's more broad and neutral, in addition to maybe reading some BBC news or listening to some American news. But quite frankly, it became too one-sided on either way. I mean, listening to CNN, it becomes just only hammering on one side. If it comes, Fox is only hammering the other side. watch local news. You don't hear nothing outside Atlanta. I mean, that's boring for me,
I do the
want to hear
same
something
thing,
what's going on in Cincinnati,
I do the same thing.
Yeah.
I mostly watch and read and follow German news.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, they do cover a lot of the American politics and what's going on here too. And they, as you said too, I agree with that. They oftentimes do it in a more neutral way and a more like condensed way sometimes, like more just on the point, like summarized, explained. Like you can just listen to it for 5 minutes and you know all the important facts.
Yeah.
In the US, I listen to NPR sometimes and those kind of things. But yeah, just a quick detour on that. I totally do the same thing, which is funny.
So what about you, Josh? Are you following then now some American news while you're in Germany? Or
I grew up always watching ABC, so I tend to follow a lot of the ABC programs that are still out there.
I like that actually too. I like Andy Murray at night, the World News.
Exactly. I was going to say David Muir for the ABC World News is. I think the name of the program needs to be adjusted because it's not World News Tonight. Oftentimes it's about 90% American news and then maybe 10% foreign. But yeah, I definitely keep up with ABC News. I've become an avid Tagesschau viewer though, just because it's a nice 15-minute. It's a quality 15-minute production that gives you all of the most important news of the day, which I really enjoy. One thing in my experience has been that American news tends to be very opinion-based oftentimes, whereas I feel like I get more of the hard facts in the German news. So I like to be able to have access to both of them for sure.
Yeah.
I was interviewed multiple times for different TVs, if it's Polish or American or
us.
Yeah.
You guys, which is really important.
American and German.
I said immediately yes, which was fun. I think you guys doing a fantastic quality program. And,
well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
So I
really
think
appreciate
it's
that.
fun to do this because more and more people like to listen to other things. And if you don't want to listen for an hour and a half, then just turn it off or come back to it, right?
Yeah, that's what I always do.
That was one of my favorite comments that I've seen from our listeners is there's a thing called the pause button.
Yeah.
If you don't like the length of it, then pause it and come back to it later.
Yeah, I do that all the time with podcasts.
Yeah, same here.
I like the video aspect of it. I know that others, some true podcasters, they prefer a 30-minute, a 35-minute, and just audio only.
Yeah.
I like this video part. I mean, for me, it's a little bit more interaction. We can see each other. You can see emotion, gesture, and some of the mimics, and say, oh yeah, So I think it's fun.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being on our podcast. And as you just said, for those of you who are currently listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can also watch us on YouTube. So if you just finished up the episode, which was probably long, you can go back to YouTube and then watch the whole thing again and see our faces.
And see our faces.
But yeah, so thank you so much, Marco. Marco Foelske, once again, you can look him up. As you just said, Marco, you've given several interviews in the past. So I'm sure there's a bunch to find about you, a bunch of information. And of course, you guys can also check out the episodes of the Muttersprache podcasts if you understand German, because Marco did quite a few of those, not anymore. But I mean, you can still follow the podcast moving forward. Of course, it's very interesting. And yeah, we're going to be back next Thursday. And until then, you guys can find us and follow us and support us on Instagram, for example, at Understanding Train Station. You can email us. Josh, where can they email us?
Yes, our email is understandingtrainstation@gmail.com. In addition to our email, we also have a Patreon set up where if you guys want to support us on a monthly basis, it's patreon.com/understandingtrainstation.
That's correct.
I had to second guess myself there for a quick second. And then our last platform that you guys can support us support us on is Buy Me a Coffee. It's buymeacoffee.com/UTS podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your support. Once again, for the, I think, fourth time, thank you for being on the podcast. Marco, I know that you could have told stories for probably days because I feel like your life experience, you just have so many stories to tell, which is awesome. So maybe we can have you back in the future at some point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and you guys can hear us again next Thursday. Tschüss from Cincinnati.
Ciao, tschüss.
Servus von Bayern.
Bye from Atlanta. Ciao.